Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on how to use storytelling when public speaking. Storytelling is a skill that everyone should use whenever they're presenting, public speaking, running seminars, even conference speaking. The ability to tell a story that engages the audience is probably one of the most influencing and influential tools you can have. So welcome to how to use stories within your public speaking. How to participate, ask questions as we go. If I don't get to the question, I'll take it on notice. Take notes for yourself. Apply the content to your own personal circumstances. Do you already use stories? Are your stories the right stories? Or could you start to incorporate storytelling within your next presentation, your next workshop, your next facilitation? Apply the knowledge to yourself. It's the thinking about how am I going to use this that's most valuable. So we all have a story to tell. Most of you on the webinar know that I'm a person who stutters, and my story is that of being unable to speak, which impacts my ability to get an education, my ability to get a job. Job interviews were diabolical, and having got a job, my ability to be promoted, move into a leadership role, because it's presumed if I can't speak effectively, then I wouldn't ever be able to be a leader. Storytelling will help you advocate on behalf of other people. It'll help you educate people by demonstrating what's happened as a result of someone doing a course, someone attending an online seminar. It can help you to influence people. The power of persuasion through storytelling is very influential. It'll help you promote new thinking, new ideas. If you've got a new way of dealing with housing crises, new way of dealing with safety messages in the mining sector, and no one wants to believe you or no one wants to change, you can tell a story about how other organisations, maybe the Canadians, have done something innovative in social housing. Maybe the UK is leading the world in the way they reduce accidents in the workplace, and the story that you tell can help people promote new thinking, which leads to creating change. And it helps people remember your messages as a speaker, trainer, facilitator. We have a saying within the speaking sector, and that saying is people don't remember much of what you've told them. Rather, they'll remember how you make them feel. So it's the memorable story that can create the experience that people remember more so than facts or data or statistics or information. They don't remember much of what you've said, but they remember how you make them feel. So if your story helps them feel that they can do this, that'll be more valuable than just a group of statistics or dot points. Now, please ask questions as we go. So we all have a story to tell. I mentioned before we started the webinar, I was chatting to a few of the early birds about the engineers, the accountants, the technical people, the scientific people. Welcome, Jilly. They say to me, but here's the data, here's the statistics, here's the numbers. I don't need a story. Why would I tell a story? The accountant will tell you the numbers enough, the numbers alone should persuade you, should influence you, should make you follow my recommendation. The problem is they don't. So this is why you tell stories. If you tell people some facts, some data, there's a 5 to 10% retention rate. I guess what I'm saying is this data that I'm sharing with you now, only 1 in 10 of you is going to remember it in a week's time. But don't worry, you've got the webinar recording that I'll make available to you. 1 in 10 will remember just facts. As with this webinar, you've got some PowerPoint slides, you've got my mugshot in my head, some minimal gestures. So if I give you some visual images, I'm increasing that retention rate to 30%. So 3 out of 10 of you on the webinar will recall some of the information that I provided you. That's a 70% of people will not recall what your message was, what you've said in a week's time. Now, this statistic comes from Stanford University. That's not a good return on investment. You spend an hour before your colleagues, an hour before your followers, your constituents, your customers. You give them some good facts, some good details. You show some beautiful PowerPoint slides, and 70% of people don't remember what you've said. If you tell a story, and this story has examples, case studies, that creates an emotional response, an engaging response, then your retention rate increases to 70%. Once again, people don't remember much of what you've told them, but they remember how you make them feel. So this is the emotions, this is the engagement, this is just the data and the facts, and this is less effective. This is what creates the memorable response, your storytelling. That's why we tell stories. The reality is that people don't remember lots of data. The other thing with stories are that they're your unique intellectual property. People cannot tell you that that did not happen, that that is not true. I know that when I started work as a person who stutters, I was overlooked and denied promotion time and time again because of the perception of my inability to be a leader, my inability to communicate because of my severe stutter. And I had to work hard to move from not being able to speak because of my stutter to moving on to being a public speaking trainer and coach. And there was lots of steps I took on that journey. No one can tell me that's not true, Peter. That didn't happen. Maybe you do work in social housing, community housing, and you're working with clients with complex needs, and you think outside the box and you connect them with some respite, with some additional resources. You connect them with a support group that helps them along the way. And as a result of that, they've moved from a place of being stuck, of feeling hopeless, to a place of now they can see light at the end of the tunnel. They've identified some housing options. They've identified some resources. They're now moving from being victims to taking ownership of their journey. And someone says to you, but hang on, that's not in the manual. That's not the way we do things here. That will never work. Hang on a moment. You did it. That's your unique intellectual property. So one of the powerful ways of using stories, your personal stories, your case studies, the people you've worked with to create successes, is that no one can tell you that that won't work or that that is not true. So stories also add to your credibility and your confidence because it is your unique lived experience and intellectual property. When you're telling your story, and this is called how to use storytelling in your public speaking, I would Encourage you where possible to try and relive part of the story. So you need to take people back and relive it, as opposed to just retell it as a narrator. Because when you relive the story, the successes, the smiles, the failures, the 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 tough times, people feel that with you, as opposed to, it was December 1980 when I went for my first job interview, and the lab manager said to me, "Peter, you'll never be a senior scientist. Your communication skills are no good. When you've fixed up your communication skills, your ability to speak, come back and try again, and we'll reconsider you for a promotion." That's me just telling you the story. I need to go back and tap into the physical emotion of the rejection. So I encourage you to, where possible, relive your story as opposed to retell your story. So here's a model for using your story within your public speaking. And it goes a bit like this. So tell your story, which includes reliving it. Tell the story. Then make a point. Here's the thing. If you tell a story and the story has no point, then you're by definition a stand-up comedian, or you're self-centered. You're telling a story about yourself to make yourself sound good. When I tell my story about my stuttering, it is to illustrate the point that is, public speaking is a skill. Anyone can become good at public speaking. You need to make a point. One of the mistakes people do is they tell lovely stories and there's nothing in it for the audience. There is no point. So in that case, you are an entertainer, a stand-up comedian, and the audience doesn't see any value in listening to your story. Which leads me to the next point. You then need to highlight, outline, reveal the benefit or the value to the audience. So here we go again. If I tell you a story that is sorry, I'll get the right thing in a moment. If I tell you a story that's engaging and creates an emotional response, is entertaining, and I make a point, a really strong point, and it has no value or benefit to you, my audience, my listener, then I've chosen the wrong story and the wrong point for that audience. Because here's the thing, and I don't want to be disrespectful. Most audiences, including yourselves, are a little bit selfish. A little bit selfish. By that I mean you're self-centered. You're listening today to this webinar not to support me, not to cheer me on, not to wave a flag for me. You're here out of self-interest. You want to learn something from me. And if I don't give you any benefit or any value, then I'm just hot air. So that's the little model I use and I teach in my public speaking workshop for your use of storytelling or relive your story when you're doing public speaking. So tell a story. Stories are everywhere. They're your anecdotes, they're your experiences. Outline the point you're making. So I grew up as a person who stuttered, and I stuttered really bad. I now do public speaking for my living. The point I'm trying to make is that public speaking is a skill. Anyone who is afraid, uncomfortable with public speaking can go on to be a great public speaker. And I know that for you, public speaking is how you influence people. Public speaking is how you get job interviews. Public speaking is how you demonstrate your leadership qualities. Your ability to stand before a group of people is how you create change for the better. That's why I tell my story about my stutter. All right, moving on. So here's the idea of the business story. So I need to take a little step back. When I say use storytelling in your public speaking, I'm not talking about bedtime stories. You are not an entertainer. You're not necessarily a comedian. Now, do tell funny stories that illustrate a point, that have value to the audience. By all means, tell funny stories. But I'm talking about the business story. So the business story is the data plus the story. And when you bring them together, that is the business story. So your data is your examples, your case studies, and I need to acknowledge that this work comes from two authors, two Victorian authors, Dolan and Naidu, and they talk about the data and the stories, and they're experts in teaching people to tell stories. So your data is your examples, your case studies, your numbers, your research, your return on investment, your break-even analysis, your risk profile. They're all the numbers. And these appeal to the logical thinker, to your head, to the rational you. So that's the data. Then we have the stories. The stories are your personal stories, your vulnerability, your, revealing your secrets, your concerns, revealing your doubt. We all know about imposter syndrome. They're your stories that have purpose. They're your struggles, your successes. These appeal to the heart. These appeal to the people's emotions, the feelings. So what they say is that a story that creates an emotional response, it's called a visceral response in the gut down here. You feel it in the pit of your stomach. So when you put these together, this is the business story. The data, the information appeals to the head. There will be logical thinkers in the room, engineers, accountants, scientists. They need the data. And the story appeals to the heart. We say go to the head first and go to the heart second. And it's the heart that people remember. It's the story, the visceral response. And together they are what inspire, move, engage, have impact, and create memorable messages as a speaker and a presenter. So I love this quote from Brené Brown, The Power of Vulnerability, her book, best-selling book. I saw Brené Brown speak in Melbourne last year. Maybe stories are just data with soul, and it's the soul that we remember. You may or may not know that we have 3 bundles of neurons in our bodies. The main one we know about is the head, and this is where we think, this is where we apply the logic. The second one is in the heart, and the bundle of neurons in the heart are called the bundle of His. The bundle of His is what sends neuron fires, electronic fires to the heart and keep the heart beating. So we can be brain dead. We can have no brain activity, and that is a diagnosis of death. As long as we have oxygen to the heart, the bundle of His will keep the heart beating by itself. So the bundle of His is that little bundle of neurons, that little brain that keeps the heart beating. So the heart can beat independent of the brain. And the third is in the gut, and those neurons are linked to the brain, and you know yourself when you shouldn't have done something. Shame on you. The gut instinct. Most people make decisions based on gut instinct. When we go shopping for Christmas, which is just gone, or some other celebration, not many people go through with an Excel spreadsheet for all their family members and have what they want, the pros and cons, the price, the value, and choose what they're going to buy. Most people go and shop and buy based on gut instinct. I just know what my wife wants. I just know what my brother needs. I can tell. And when you send information, when you give messages, you are selling. So you want people to buy your message. They're not in Myers or David Jones, but they're in your seminar, and you still need to appeal to that visceral response. That's the power of storytelling. Just going to pause for a moment. Are there any questions? Just type them in the Q&A box if you do have any questions. Thanks, Sarah. Sarah's just asked me, what do you do if you don't have any stories that relate to your point? Really good question, and I'll answer. And I've got another question from just a comment. All good, thank you. So if you don't have your own stories, so you want to talk about a new way of doing social housing or a new way of working with people with an intellectual disability, you may have to borrow a story from somewhere else. I mentioned Canadians or the UK, so don't be afraid to borrow a story. The shortcoming with borrowing a story is it's harder for you to relive that story because it's not your story. So you need to kind of tell the story, but when you tell the story, you would apply it to a family, some individuals that you know that are struggling, and you know how the story, the Canadian model, the UK model, would really help these people. And that's where you can get some emotion within yourself. And what you're really trying to do is help a group of people that have fallen through the cracks. Australia doesn't have a system that encompasses them. The Canadians are doing something really clever. Borrow that story. When you borrow a story, you need to acknowledge it. So this model on data versus story does not belong to me. It belongs to Dolan and Naidu, who wrote a book around how to tell business stories. Thanks for that question. So where do your stories come from? You can borrow the stories, but the best stories come from the heart rather than the head. So don't think too logically about them. Just relive those experiences. So those mistakes you made, they're not failures, they are lessons. The people you meet that share things with you, the problems you solve. Here's some Navy SEALs. The Navy SEALs training is built on problem solving as a team, because it's the team success that matters more than the individual success. Those insurmountable problems, the unexpected events that turn up, the confounding variables, the confounding problems, and just everyday life. Just everyday life. One of the workshops I do is around courageous leadership. And one of the things around courageous leadership is having a mindset. And one of those mindsets, various mindset as well as mindfulness, one of the mindsets is understanding that there's no mistakes in life, just lessons. And courageous leaders empower, allow their workers to make mistakes. This is where innovation comes from. This is where creativity comes from. Trying something that doesn't work, adjusting, learning, changing, and trying it again. This means along the way you lose money, you lose time, you lose resources, you make mistakes. And the leader that comes down hard on you and says, no, you can't do that, stifles creativity. So in everyday life, I remember when My granddaughter's about to turn 4. When my granddaughter was first born, she was brought home early and she had a daily visit from a midwife, an early childhood nurse. And one day she was weighing her and my granddaughter urinated all over the nurse, weighing and urine all down her front. And the nurse said, "Wow, that is absolutely fantastic. This young baby is getting lots of liquid, they're fully hydrated, they're doing really, really well. You're doing a really good job as a mother." So everyday stuff that happens to you, there's a story there. Now, I gave you the very short version of that story. The point is, stories are everywhere. Those things that happen to you, you can use them to demonstrate. Now, I tell that story in my Courageous Leadership workshop, and how that mindset of a failure or a mistake, I mean, I've just covered in urine now, how that nurse was able to put a positive spin onto that. Stories are everywhere. Here's the thing, excuse me for looking away. Grab yourself a journal, carry it with you and write those stories down. What's the story? What's the point that's in the story? You can turn there's no mistakes, just lessons. And which audience, or how does that demonstrate value to people? Which audience am I going to use it for? So collect stories everywhere, and I call it build your library of stories. Even the stories you borrow, you can still write them down. When you hear about them, when you see them, that's where you get your stories from. And remember, the best stories come from the heart, so less about thinking. You know, my granddaughter's 4. She stays with us one day a week after school. I can get really emotional in telling that story. No need today. We don't have time today. So stories come from the heart more so than from the head. And I'll just kind of wrap up a little bit from Seth Godin. And I love this quote from Seth Godin. So the marketer's job then is to tell a true story, one that resonates with you, resonates with the audience, one that matters to people. If it's no value, no benefit to you, then wrong story to the wrong person. So that matters to the people, and to repeat it often enough that it creates value. Storytelling. Everyone who does public speaking should incorporate storytelling. Upcoming workshops: Perth, Darwin. I've just set some dates for Karratha in March for those of you who are in Karratha, and we've got Melbourne trips in May, June and August 2020. Next webinars: Next webinar is how to build confidence and peer calm as a speaker. 6th of February. Is your message clear? Are you on track? And once again, the storytelling helps keep you on track. So your story needs to echo your core message, not be an adjacent or a side story. Otherwise, people go down a rabbit hole and they lose your core message. Those are 2 webinars, free. Share them around with your colleagues. February the 6th and February the 20th. And that's the end of the webinar. So you know how to reach me. My website, peter@peterdew.com.au for an email. Follow me on LinkedIn if you wish to. If you do connect with me on LinkedIn, please let me know that you've attended a webinar. So just remember, storytelling, it's a bit of an art, it's a bit of a craft, but when you master it, it's just an integral, normal, everyday part of public speaking. Storytellings will engage your audience, they will influence them, and you really need them to have impact. Bye for now.